everybody. It is December and that means that I have all of the books that I read in November to talk about. It's hard to believe that it's actually December because right outside my window it's very sunny and there's no snow yet, even though I wish there was. But what can you do? I included my phone in there because I read an audiobook on my phone. I'll talk about the audiobook when I get to that because I'm talking about the books in the order that I read them. The first one was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and I read it in this copy, but I bought another copy after I finished it because I wanted to be able to pass one of them on so that I could share the story with other people and give it to them. So the story actually surprised me a little bit because it starts off with letters, and the letters are not addressed to anyone named Frankenstein or written by anyone named Frankenstein, but they begin to immerse you in the story and set up what you're going to read. The book mostly follows Victor Frankenstein, a man who is the creator of the monster, and he was an interesting character to read about because I sympathized with him because the relationship that he had with the monster, it was kind of sad because he basically created the monster and then just let it be, and the monster was all alone. I found this book to be very interesting, but I will add that I was trying to read it while I was reading a different book for school. I lost the immersion because of that, so I want to reread this at some point because I feel like I will get more out of it upon a reread. It was really interesting how it went into human nature and the monster's thoughts, because the monster, it was more intelligent than I had expected, and he was actually very philosophical and he understood a lot. I really enjoyed this book. When I got to the end of it, like the last, I don't know, 40 pages or so, I couldn't put it down and I read that whole section at one point. So yeah, that was a fun read and I'm very glad that I read it. And after that one, I decided that I needed something a little bit more lighthearted. So I went with Wonderstuck by Brian Selznick. Now, I think Brian Selznick is better known for this book that was also a movie, and this is the book that he wrote after that. So it has the same format of the prose with the pictures combined, and that's how the story is told. I really liked how the two stories came together because you hear the boy's story, his name is Ben, throughout the prose, and then there's a girl's story that you hear with the pictures, and it was very interesting to see when the prose would end versus when the pictures would end, because it almost always, each section ended where the two connected, because it alternates throughout the book. Like the Hugo Cabret book, I really enjoyed this one. I flew through it, which you wouldn't expect because it's so long, but I think I read it within a day. The two stories take place 50 years apart, and I think it is kind of supposed to be a mystery to see how they're interconnected. And for me, I figured out part of it, but I think it's because he foreshadowed a lot of it, and it's a children's book. But that didn't make the book any less fun for me. I still really enjoyed it. And the next book that I read was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I was expecting to really enjoy it, and I did. I took a lot of notes, and I annotated it a lot. It's a classic that seems to be very loved. I've seen and heard from a lot of people that it is a favorite, and I can definitely see why after reading it. I actually read Jane Eyre around the same time last year, so it was kind of cool to pick up another Bronte novel. This one's very different, and you can see the distinction between Charlotte and Emily. I go into a lot more detail about the story in my separate video review. It follows Heathcliff as the main character. It goes very in-depth to his backstory and his life. I've heard different opinions on whether or not this is a love story. My personal perception of it was that it's about love and it's about revenge. I think revenge plays a greater role than love does. And after Wuthering Heights, I listened to The Age of Miracles by Karen Thompson Walker. I had heard really good reviews on it on YouTube, and I was excited. So it is kind of dystopian. It takes place in this kind of what if scenario. If the rotation of the sun changed, all of the patterns that were once familiar and predictable go away. So the sun does not rise and set at the same time. And sometimes in this story, it is daylight for 24 hours and night for 24 hours. So it follows the protagonist named Julia and her experience growing up with this disaster going on. And if anything, I would say that it's a coming of age story because it really follows Julia's life and what she goes through. She goes through the loss of friendship as her and her friends grow apart. She goes through having a crush and feeling like she doesn't fit in at school. And I think that's one of the really strong aspects of the book, looking at childhood and growing up. The other one is that I think the book looks at society, and it kind of analyzes what would happen to society and how people would react if a disaster like that would happen. Something that was interesting, that I found interesting anyways, is that as the sun patterns change, some people and the government kind of promotes following the clock as it always had been, the 24 hours. And even when the sun's not out, still going to school at the same time. And that's the majority. There's a smaller group of people that decides to stick to sun time and let their circadian rhythms match that. So they will eventually be up for 48 hours in the sun and then sleep for 48 hours at night. And then there is a conflict between the people that follow clock time and sun time, and people who follow the sun naturally are seen as more outcasts and social pariahs. And it was really interesting to see that and see how the society was impacted by trying to deal with a natural disaster, and I really liked that part of the book. I think that the book portrayed growing up very well, and I think that's why I like the book so much. I gave it 5 stars, and I know that it's a new favorite book for me. I've never read a book that shows a character in the process of, I think she starts off 10 years old and she's growing up, she's in middle school, and it just perfectly showed everything, and I loved it for that. So I love that book. And the last book was The Book of Merlyn by T.H. White, which is kind of a sequel to The Once and Future King by T.H. White. And The Book of Merlyn picks up where the final chapter of The Once and Future King ends. And something about it that is mentioned in the preface is that it was published incomplete. So the author didn't get a chance to polish it up and to get it 100% the way that he wanted it when the publishers did get their hands on it. So I kind of had that in mind while I was reading it. I think this is the type of book that someone would only enjoy if they have read The Once and Future King. Because you aren't getting a lot of introduction to the characters because you already know them. You already have established the relationship between Merlyn and Arthur in the previous books, and that is why you're able to appreciate the dynamic between the two in this one. There isn't that much plot to this book. It really focuses on ideas and politics and philosophy more than anything else. I think T.H. White was trying to, as he said in the preface, bring the idea full circle. Seeds that he planted in The Once and Future King are more developed in this book. And I liked that about it a lot. I really liked seeing Merlyn again. There were some points that I was reading dialogue and things that Merlyn said were actually really funny. And I also enjoyed reading the different ideas that were established within this book, because basically you have a council of creatures, including Merlyn and Arthur, and a few people that you've met previously, and they are talking about war, and they are trying to establish why it exists, what function it plays, and if there would be a way to end it. And you see Arthur continue his journey that he starts in The Once and Future King of thinking through and becoming a creature through Merlyn's magic and experiencing what being in other societies is like in terms of war. So it was really interesting. It just wasn't entertaining like The Once and Future King is. Sometimes when I read it, I could kind of see where perhaps T.H. White wanted it to be a little bit more polished and he wasn't done working on it. But overall, I am very glad that I read it. I think that it does bring the story of The Once and Future King full circle. So that's a good addition to read both of them. Those are the books that I read in November. They're heavy with this one. I'm glad that I can now put these two on my shelf next to each other because that looks kind of cool. I hope that you also had a good reading month, and I would love to hear some of the good books that you read in the comments down below. I'll see you next time. Bye!